continue to join in, but maybe we can start with a short overview of the format and some introductions. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. This is the second webinar of the e-commerce behind the tech scene series. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. And if you've attended one of our webinars before, welcome back. I would like to give a short overview of the format of the talk first, before we move on to some introductions. The first part of the webinar will be Sebastian's presentation, and we have saved some time at the end for Q&A. There is a Q&A option in Zoom, so you can post your questions there and even upvote the ones you find the most interesting and you would like answered. If you want to make a comment, ask a question, or share your experience by talking instead of typing, you can always use the raise your hand option through the button at the bottom of your console. Will allow you to speak as soon as possible. Moving on to some short introductions. My name is Aubena. I'm head of tech relations and growth at Zartis, and I will be moderating this talk. Our speaker is Sebastian Mach, co-founder and CTO of Byrd. To give a very short background on Zartis as organizer, Zartis is a software services company with 100+ engineers distributed across Europe. We provide nearshoring, extended development, and consulting services, enabling companies to build software in a faster, better way. As a company, we have extensive expertise in the e-commerce technology domain, and the purpose of this series of webinars is to learn from the community and the insights shared by our speakers and all of you as attendees. I'm very happy to present our speaker today, Sebastian Mach, CTO at Byrd. Byrd offers an e-commerce fulfillment platform that helps SMEs to easily outsource their logistics so that they can focus on their core competencies and efficiently grow their business. Their intuitive web application allows retail companies to manage all order within a few clicks, while Byrd takes care of the entire process from storage to dispatch. Most recently, the company raised 5 million in a Series A funding round to scale their platform and grow internationally. As someone on the forefront of logistics and fulfillment, Sebastian has a unique insight into the technology that can help us address this fundamental challenge, which lies at the very core of every e-commerce business. With that, I'm very much looking forward to the presentation, and I'll pass on the floor to Sebastian.
Cool, thanks a lot for the introduction. So I'm really happy to be here today. So yeah, I mean, I've been already said a few words about myself. So just very briefly, I'm Sebastian. I'm CTO and co-founder of Byrd. And before we get started, maybe just a few words again about Byrd so that you have kind of the background information, what we're doing, like how we actually get into this whole logistics, like how we are relevant in that sector. So basically, as already explained, Byrd is a fulfillment company. So basically what we're doing is we're shipping products for e-commerce online shops, right? And if you look at the spectrum, like from order placement, payment, and delivery, we are kind of here in this fulfillment area. So we store the products and we connect to your online shop, for example, and dispatch the orders as soon as they get into the system, and kind of like how we want to differentiate ourselves from other like more classical fulfillment providers is that we want to make it really easy to integrate. For example, if you have a Shopify shop, you know how easy it is to set up your shop and how easy it is to integrate PayPal and so on. So we basically want to have this kind of same level of easiness to get started with your whole fulfillment. And we don't only do that in just one warehouse, but we actually have over 10 fulfillment locations in Europe, starting from Austria, Germany, UK, France, and Netherlands. And we're actually planning to open more than 20 more locations in 2020. By doing that, we offer same-day fulfillment and next-day delivery in our core markets. So if you place an order today, we will ship it still today and usually arrives tomorrow at your customer's doorstep. And as I mentioned before, we're fully integrated with the online shop, so there's no like CSV file or Excel fast required. It's all automated. And we also integrated more than 15 shipping carriers in those countries. So yeah, that's kind of our background, what we're doing. And yeah, I think it's quite interesting what we saw along the way by working with different online shops and integrating with different carriers. And I'm really happy to share basically what challenges we faced along the way. So there's quite a lot of things that we've seen, and maybe that's insightful or helpful for you if you either starting with an online shop or you already have one and want to scale it up. So hopefully that's interesting for you. So yeah, basically I want to focus on like 3 main areas, like where we see some challenges, starting with the online shop, then coming to the warehouse, since we obviously have some warehouses, and last but not least the carriers, because there's different challenges from a technical perspective that I think are worth talking about. So yeah, let's get started with the online shop, and let's look at the kind of user journey again. So if you think about where does logistics actually start, like where does the warehouse come in, or like the logistics part in general, and usually would say, yeah, obviously here in the warehouse, like in the fulfillment part, but actually I would say it starts much earlier, mainly in your online shop. And why I will explain in a moment. So you have kind of a list of the 5 most or 5 biggest challenges we saw along the way. And the first one is if you have more than one fulfillment location. So if you imagine you have one online shop, but you have more than one warehouse, like 2, 3, or even more than that. Basically, you have multiple fulfillment locations. There might be different reasons why you want to do that. One reason, for example, is because you have two core markets. Let's say Austria and Germany, for example. And because you want to be very close to your customers, you want to ship from both countries to be very fast and also more cost efficient. Or for some other reasons, like if you have different manufacturers which are closer to those warehouses and so on. But there's a few challenges, like starting with the order distribution, for example. So if a customer places an order, you need to decide where to actually ship it from. So either based on the availability of the products or based on the country, you might want to decide from which warehouse to actually ship the order. You also need to keep track of the stock. So you want to synchronize the stock from these different warehouses. And at the end of the day, you also need to know where to return your products if there's any returns. And the issue we see is that a lot of shop systems, such as Shopify, for example, or WooCommerce, they don't really have that kind of multi-fulfillment location concept in mind. So it's actually quite difficult, for example, if you use Shopify to fulfill from more than one warehouse. So if you already know that that's something you want to do at some point, then that's one of the considerations you should have when you choose your online shop. Usually what our customers are doing, or what we recommend, is that you also look at some different ERP systems. There's a couple of different providers out there, such as Bilby, Plenty Markets, and other ones, which basically have more support for these kind of situations where you need to fulfill from more than one warehouse. I mean, very specifically, Shopify already made some efforts into that direction, where you have multiple locations, but still with external fulfillment providers, it's still quite difficult to support that. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Another very common situation is where you might want to sell different products in different markets. So in this example, when you have product A that you sell in Germany, for example, and you have product B you sell in France, maybe they're customized for that market, or you don't want to market them in the other country. That's again something that you couldn't do with most of the kind of like low-key standard online shops. So for example, if our customers many of them are using Shopify, for example, they end up setting basically 2 Shopify accounts, one for each country, to be able to specify that in more detail. But if you have maybe more than 2 markets, then it gets very tricky very fast. So again, their ERP system can really help you. Another very frequently asked thing is order customization. So if if you sell a product like a shoe in this example, if your customer orders a shoe, then you might want to add different add-ons, giveaways, or specific branding materials based on the order. So one example is, for example, is it the first order from this customer, then maybe you want to add some branding like a voucher, recommend us to your friends or anything, that you do some basic marketing efforts. Maybe if it's the 10th order, so it's a very, it's a recurring customer basically, and you want to like, say thank you for staying with us, and you might want to add like special goodie or like a free product, or if you just launched a new product, you want to add it for free. Or another example is if the order value is over $100, you might want to offer free express shipping, something like that. And again, that's something that's where an ERP system can help to customize this kind of flow. That's very difficult to do in, for example, WooCommerce. Shopify has one plugin called Shopify Flow, which already tries to go into that direction, but it's still very basic, and you might not be able to cover some of those things. And we, for example, we implemented in our WMS system also some functionality where you can customize the order, because usually the online shop can't do that, and it's kind of difficult if you realize it afterwards, after you already set up your shop, and then you want to change something afterwards. Another very common thing, especially in the logistics sector, are incorrect addresses. So there's, it's especially problematic if you don't realize that the address is incorrect. So we had some cases where we, for example, shipped out products and then they came back with the reason like the address is incorrect, and only then we realized that there's something wrong with the address. So what you might want to do is already, during the checkout process, make sure that the customer enters a correct address. But there's also some very common misconceptions about addresses. So one example is like an assumption that every address has a postal code, right? And it's actually wrong. There's some countries that just don't have a postal code. So if you, for example, would require that, you might end up that your customer can't purchase because you require a postal code, but you can't really enter anything. Another, great example is that street names might be reasonably short, like 50 characters or less. And there's another funny example, like I think this is the longest address in Germany, the Bischöflich-Geistliche Rat Josef Zimbauer Straße. So it's more than 50 characters. So again, if you do this kind of like rudimentary address checks, it might end up actually costing you sales because your customers can't order. This address actually exists here in Germany. I just Googled it before. You can find it here. So what we would recommend in this case is have kind of like an auto-complete, like with like a Google Maps API integration, for example, where if you start typing the address, you can basically auto-complete the address. And the last thing, I mean, if you're a technical, technical owner of an online shop, you might think about this, but we actually had quite a few customers that didn't, have their server stability and scalability in mind. So when they had like a huge marketing campaign, for example, they had a TV ad or something, this is what their server looked like. It was completely overwhelmed and you couldn't really scale it up. And then we had, for example, the problem that that we couldn't actually import their orders because their server was constantly crashing, and they complained like, I can't see my orders in your system, but then we had to tell them, yeah, but your server is overwhelmed. So if you have marketing campaigns in mind, then make sure that your server is scaled up. And yeah, so basically to summarize, the key takeaways from the online shop are, first of all, use an ERP system. If you already know you might have more advanced use cases that maybe can't be implemented in the online shop you anticipated in the first place. I would really recommend not to host the server yourself. If you, for example, use Shopify, it's not an issue anyways because they are doing it for you. But for example, WooCommerce sounds great because you don't have any license fees because it's open source. But then again, you have to keep the server cost in mind, and you actually need to administrate the server. So in that case, I would then still recommend to go with a professional hosting provider so that you don't have this kind of issue. And yeah, use address autocomplete and validation during checkout, but keep that special cases in mind because it might end, losing some sales due to that. Yeah, then maybe looking at the kind of second challenge in the warehouse, I think that's particularly interesting because it's kind of the core of this whole logistics sector. And kind of the first opening statement to keep in mind is like what's actually relevant in the warehouse. And one thing I think that's quite interesting is based on our kind of internal data, we see that 88% of the warehouse costs are basically personnel costs, except if you exclude shipping costs. But that's basically the most expensive thing in your warehouse. And by keeping that in mind, there's basically two key success factors we see in the warehouse, which are first efficiency and second high availability. Because if you keep in mind that the majority of your cost driver are the people in the warehouse, you really want to make sure that these two things are done right. So if you look at efficiency, there's basically two components to that. The one component is software, the other component is hardware. So a lot of I would say old school logistics companies that are not very technological. They usually pick by pick lists. So they literally at the beginning of the day they print paper on a printer, and they're line items, and they know where to pick from. But it gets really inefficient very quickly if you have a bigger warehouse. So from the beginning onwards, for example, we at Byrd made sure that we develop a software that really helps the people in the warehouse to become more efficient so they know where they need to pick their products from. But it's really important to keep in mind that the processes you implement in your warehouse are software aided, so that you make sure that the people are as efficient as they can be. But the other point, which was also quite interesting, is the hardware, because it's kind of the basis where you start. The best software can't do anything if you don't have proper hardware. And here's kind of an interesting example we had at Byrd, for example. So at the beginning, we were using these two devices for picking, for example. So you need to imagine there's a couple of people in the warehouse which job it is to pick the products for the individual orders. And they were equipped with the smartphone here. It's kind of a standard consumer Motorola based smartphone, and also like a ring scanner, so they could scan the products during picking. And we basically developed our own app that showed them where to pick from and which items or which products they should pick. And this costed around 250 euros. And we thought, yeah, it's fine. It's a reasonable price for picking hardware. But recently we actually upgraded to more professional devices, which cost us around 1,400 euros. And maybe first you might think but that's crazy, right? Why would you spend so much more money on a fancy smartphone? But the reason for that is that we actually managed to, by just switching from this, kind of crappy, cheap China scanner to this more professional one, we managed to increase our efficiency by around 2%. And we would estimate that we can gain another 5% by, developing software which can more utilize the features of these devices by up to 5%. And if you think again, about 88% of your warehouse costs are basically personnel costs. If the picker can save only 1 second per order, if you have thousands or even tens of thousands of orders per day, then this really makes a huge difference. So the money is actually well spent by just making the people more efficient in the warehouse. And the other thing, which is, especially if you start doing it yourself, if you start fulfilling your orders yourself, these are the kind of things that you don't necessarily think about. Or also if you come from a more private sector at home, you might want to think about your internet connection. And if you're watching Netflix in the evening and your internet breaks down, it's maybe a bummer, but it doesn't really have a big impact. But again, if you think about, you have maybe 20, 30 people in your warehouse, and then if the internet breaks down, they can't really do anything. They're standing still, and it literally costs you money. And we already had the case at some point where we had the apparently stable, fast DSL connection, but for some reason it wasn't working on one day, and then we had to send home the people because they couldn't really work. So that's when we tried to make sure that we also have kind of a redundant, internet connection. So even if one breaks down, you still have a backup because if people are standing still, it's literally costing you money because you have to pay them, and there you might as well want to spend some good money on your internet connection to make sure that that's working properly. And the other thing is also stable Wi-Fi. So if you again think about your home, you might want to buy the kind of cheapest Wi-Fi router you get because it doesn't really make a difference. But then again, if you have a huge warehouse with like metal racks where reception might be not that good, you might want to think about actually getting some more professional devices, because again, if the connection is not that good and it takes like 1 or 2 more seconds for every order loading time because the Wi-Fi is not good, then again, it actually can cost you quite some money. So that's kind of the things that we also have in mind at our fulfillment locations, that we have a fast internet connection, redundant internet connection, and Wi-Fi there. So again, maybe to summarize the kind of key takeaways from that sector, the one thing I would actually recommend is to outsource the fulfillment so that you don't even have to deal with that in the first place, especially if you just getting started. If you have a new online shop, there's really other things you want to take care of. You don't necessarily want to think about efficiency in your warehouse. You probably want to think about how can you make your marketing strategies better. How can you sell more of your products? If you have a product like a physical product, you also might want to improve that as well, talk to your customers and so on. So this is kind of the thing that you don't necessarily want to do. So the one thing that I would actually recommend is to not do yourself, but rather outsource that. If you do decide to actually run the warehouse yourself for whatever reason, that's also fair enough, but then make sure that you have a stable and redundant internet connection. Maybe spend a bit more money on that, because again, if that's not working for half a day, it's really costs you money. And last but not least, it was also an interesting learning for us to get professional MDA devices. So MDA stands for mobile data acquisition. So basically this fancy phone, you would call an MDA device. Because again, while it's still significantly more expensive than a cheap consumer product, it can actually save you money at the end of the day if you make your people more efficient in the warehouse. And kind of challenge number 3 are the carriers. And I think that's kind of funny because usually you only see that from a consumer perspective, but this is kind of the other way around. Like when you actually, put your products into the system. And we actually also challenged a few issues along the way. And the first thing that I noticed is that carriers is actually very old school. And what do I mean by that? So when you again think about a Shopify shop or like a modern shop system, you're used to good user interfaces. They have a good UX. It's very easy to use. You have good, well-documented APIs. But if you work with a kind of classical carrier such as DHL in Germany, for example, you shouldn't expect those things to be there. And to be a bit more specific, so the first thing that we kind of saw, it's actually very hard to get a contract with those logistics companies, or at least to get a good contract. If you're just getting started and you maybe have low volumes, you might not even get a contract at all, because they tell you if you don't have 100 shipments per day, then you're not really interesting to us. We want to give you a contract. If you manage to get a contract and you want to integrate with the carrier, you basically need to request access to their API docs and kind of a staging or test system. It's not something that's publicly available. For example, again, Shopify, you can just go to their kind of QA page or like technical documentation, and you can read it there. You have a very good forum where you can ask questions, but those carriers, they don't really have that in place. And based on our experience, it can take up to 2 months actually to get access to those documents. And some carriers don't even have a staging system, so they just require you to work with the kind of production system, and also can't really support you with integrating with them. And most of them have SOAP APIs. So REST is not really common in this area, and they're also quite difficult to integrate because they have some kind of quirks, and again, it's not super well documented. So it actually takes quite a long time to integrate those carriers. And one thing that was kind of surprising to me is that also their APIs can actually break relatively easily and they're quite unstable. So one example was with DHL last year in the Christmas season. They actually had a few issues with their API. So first, for some reason, their SSL certificates ran out, so we couldn't connect to their APIs because our service rejected the outdated certificate, and it took them a day to actually fix that. And then during the high season, during Christmas, actually their API constantly broke down, and we had the issue that we couldn't generate any shipping labels because their server were apparently overwhelmed, and so it was kind of tricky. And luckily we had some other carriers integrated, so we could actually fall back to somebody else. But again, I wouldn't necessarily rely on their APIs being available. And last but not least, if you integrate with the carriers yourself, you need to do that for every single carrier. You need to get a contract, you need to integrate with the APIs, and it's just very difficult. So what I would actually recommend is to, again, outsource that, either your full fulfillment, because then you don't need to take care of that at all. Or again, if you want to do it yourself, that you use kind of a label reseller. So there's some companies out there which specialize to actually provide better APIs for shipping carriers. And usually they also integrate multiple shipping carriers. So depending on where you're from, either Europe or the US, there's different providers which offer that. And the good thing there is that, first of all, you have better documentation. They usually support you with integration. If you have a Shopify shop, for example, or some other common shop, they also have usually plugins where you can directly print it from the shop. So DHL doesn't offer any type of, or GLS doesn't offer any type of plugin for the shop. And then again, if for some reason during the next Christmas season the DHL API is down, you can easily switch to another carrier, which is more stable. So here you have some more flexibility. And again, if you get started with your online shop, it's actually very time saving, because again, if you integrate yourself, it's quite difficult to do that. Yeah, and again, if you integrate with this kind of label reseller, you, as I already mentioned, have a selection of carriers. And another thing that also some of our customers are doing, they actually offer the selection of the carrier during the checkout process. So during the checkout, the consumer could select if they want to use DHL or GLS for some reason, because sometimes, for example, if you're in a more rural area, you might already know that, I don't know, DPD is not really delivering to your door because they don't really have that coverage there, and then maybe they are even willing to pay an extra price to get it with DHL. But it's always quite a good idea to offer that kind of flexibility to your customers. Also, some express shipments like DHL Express or UPS, and sometimes you can even charge for that. But yeah, to summarize again, key takeaways here, as I already mentioned, I would really recommend to outsource that to somebody else, because then it's not on your plate, and you can focus on what's really important to your business. If you do decide to actually ship the product yourself, I mean, if you're just getting started, it might make sense for the first few shipments to do that. But I would definitely recommend to use a label reseller rather than integrating yourself. So again, there's a couple of plugins for different shop systems. It's really easy to get started with that. And you should offer your customers kind of a selection of carriers so that they're more flexible in terms of how they want their parcels to be delivered. And yeah, kind of a closing summary before we go to the QA section. A few things that we recommend to our customers if they start with us or if they start working with us. What I already mentioned, to outsource the fulfillment in the first place, but also to think about the needs of your shop system. So again, if you already anticipate that you have some more complex use cases in terms of multi-warehouse shipping or some order customization, it's always good to have that in mind when you basically set up your shop in the first place, because changing these processes later on might actually be a bit difficult, also to migrate everything over to the other shop. When you haven't set up a shop previously, I would also recommend to actually get a professional to help with that, because usually the different shop systems have different kind of quirks, and it's not always that easy to find something out, and maybe you're not even aware if if that's possible with your shop. And we saw a lot of customers that struggle with that, and then we usually recommended them kind of an agency or somebody that's, you know, doing that, which is their main job, that can do that, because you're just faster. Basically, you don't need to take care of that yourself. And the last thing, which is not necessarily technical, but I think still worth mentioning, is to look at where your customer is actually buying from. So let's say if you're a German company, but the majority of your customers is coming from France, for example, you might want to consider actually having a warehouse in France, because two benefits you have there is, first of all, you have lower logistics costs because you just ship within the same country, and you actually have shorter lead times. So from the moment the warehouse dispatches your order till it arrives at the doorstep from the customers is lower, which again drives satisfaction of your customers. So that's something to look out for. And maybe if you have 2 or 3 core markets, it might actually make sense to have multiple warehouses, again, to reduce your logistics cost and reduce the lead times. So I think that's also something quite interesting to look out for. Yeah, and I think that's it from my side. Hope that was insightful, and I think there's also a Q&A section now. So I'm really curious about your questions.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. That was super interesting. I think even as a consumer, I recognize myself in some of the challenges you're mentioning. I used to actually live in Ireland, where their postcode system could use some improvement, let's put it that way. But I think postcodes are not very widely spread. So I have been refused from e-commerce websites to order because I couldn't provide a proper postcode. So I really felt that. That was really, really interesting. And we actually have quite a few questions coming in. Apologies. As a quick reminder to those who joined later, there are 2 ways to ask a question. One is to raise your hand, in which case we'll allow you to speak, or to type in your question through the Q&A option. So we actually, apologies, have one raised hand. Rakesh, I'm gonna allow you to ask your question now. You need to unmute yourself on your end, Rakesh. You should be allowed to speak now.
Hey, Albina, this webinar is really good. So, because I'm currently working on this e-commerce from last 16 years, and these are the really good concepts. What I understand from this webinar.
Very good to hear. That's very positive feedback. I can only agree that Sebastian's presentation was amazing. Do you have a question?
No, I think I'm good for now, because whatever doubts I had in my mind, because I'm basically from the development side, so we are building a lot of stuff and we are just publishing to the web. But after that, we don't know how e-commerce, these all fundas works. So this was the first time for me, but this was pretty interesting.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for the feedback. Very good to hear. So we have one question from Caroline. She says, do you have a reverse logistics solution for businesses that have refillable or circular products?
Mm-hmm. So I guess the question is more specific towards Byrd, whether we are offering that or not. I mean, what we do offer to our customers are generally returns. So if you ship out the product and you want to return it, then we have kind of a return solution that that the consumer can ship it back to the warehouse, and we would look at those products, and depending on the condition, we would either put it back on stock or put it separately so that they can be either discarded or like replenished. But if your business revolves around like, if that's your main business, then I would probably say that it's not something that we're focused on at the moment. I'm not quite sure if there's maybe a concrete example, like what would be an example of circular products, but usually I think in general our return rates are quite low at the moment, but especially, for example, in fashion, you see quite high returns. But if the business revolves around kind of 100% return rate, we're probably not the best partner for that at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I'll let Caroline follow up with examples if she wants to. I assume some on top of my head would be, I know there's some companies who offer refillable house products, so washing liquids and things like that, that you can return the bottle and they refill it for you. But I suppose it's kind of, that feels a little bit outside of your area, I guess.
I think that's super interesting in terms of like how the economy changes. So that's, I think, very interesting for the future in terms of like how you make specific products more economic. But again, that's something that we are at the moment are not focusing on. It's more about the one direction, just shipping it out of the warehouse rather than getting it back.
Fair enough. We have one more raised hand from Victor. So Victor, I've given you the floor. If you unmute yourself as well, you should be able to ask a question.
Hello. Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting and very clear and easy to follow webinar. And I think I just had a few maybe questions. One of them would be, and I think it was interesting. You were talking about having a very good Wi-Fi connection, a good internet. I think that's crucial. That's very important, critical. But in case you don't have that, like, do you envision, or do you have anything to, let's say, to be able to you need to take an order, or you need to process something and internet is not available or malfunctioning, you can have this like store in a queue or something and process later and things like that?
Got it. Yeah. I mean, if I understand correctly, it's about the warehouse. If for example, you would have a warehouse that doesn't have an internet connection, if that's correct. So our software, I mean, I think it's very important to understand that we don't use a third-party warehouse management system, but rather we developed it ourselves in-house, and we basically base that on having an internet available. So it's kind of the prerequisites in order to work with a warehouse. And that's also the reason why we really want to make sure that there's a stable internet connection that's always available. And then there are some ways how you can get an internet even in very remote areas where you wouldn't really have good reception. There's some technical solutions for that. But if the use case would be more about you have an offline warehouse where you don't have any internet whatsoever, then you would probably have different processes like physical picking lists, again, like some pieces of paper that you would work with. But if you think about, again, the efficiency of your warehouse, if you think about the biggest cost is actually the people in the warehouse. So like the rent is only a fraction of what we pay to the workers. I think you should think about whether you want to actually run a warehouse which is completely offline, where you can really work with software that, or at least not with software that relies on a web or like an internet to be available. So maybe it would be a better decision to look for another location which does have better internet connection. But I mean, there's, depending on your use case, there's surely solutions where you can also work offline. But in our case, it wouldn't make that much sense.
Okay, I think that's fair enough. Like, for instance, you were saying as well, in case of careers, they use old technologies, right? Like soap and they don't seem to be reliable. Like they can break sometimes and so on, right? So I guess you take that into account, right? Like if they are down, you can retry later and things like that, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's also quite interesting. So how we work is that there's this kind of two-step process in the warehouse where first there's a picker picking the actual physical products. And then in the second step, there's the packaging process where a separate worker would take the products, wrap them up and put it into a box. And then we have this process where they enter the dimensions and the weight of the parcel, and we will automatically generate the shipping label from the carrier. And then again, if, for example, DHL is offline at this moment, then this process is kind of interrupted. So they cannot print the physical label, they would get an error. And that's why it's quite critical for us, at least, to have a kind of that the carrier API is available and it doesn't break or anything. And again, when we had the situation last year during the Christmas season, for example, we were lucky enough to have a kind of a fallback carrier, in this case GLS, and we just switched to GLS for half a day so that the people could actually continue working. Because there's also certain cutoff times with the carriers that you need to finish the packaging till a certain time so that you can actually pick it up the same day and to make sure it's delivered the next day. So even if you can try it again later, this kind of interrupts the whole chain, and we wouldn't be able to hold our SLAs towards our customers. So that's why it was kind of tricky for us that the DHL didn't provide a stable API.
That's great. So the question could be, how many e-commerce platforms? Maybe you mentioned this in careers. Do you integrate with approximately? Could you know that?
Do you mean like the online shops or the carriers itself?
Yeah, well, both. How many platforms? Like you were saying, I think WooCommerce, and I think you were mentioning a few e-commerce platforms that you are integrating with, right? And also you integrating with different careers. No, it's just to have an idea.
Yeah, so I think we have at the moment around 10 different shop systems we're integrating with. They're more focused on the Austrian and German market because that's where we started. Although we're also constantly extending that portfolio. We also do have a REST API where you could, even if you have a custom developed ERP system, you could very easily integrate with our software. And at the moment, I think we have around 17 or 18 different carriers integrated. I don't have the exact number. So especially if we go to new countries. So usually within every country, you have one specific carrier that's kind of the market leader. Although it's probably more expensive than anybody else. So for every country we are in, we have kind of a main carrier, and then depending on customer needs, we integrate with more carriers. So I think at the moment we have around 17 or 18 different carriers we can ship with.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome. One more question from the audience. What do you expect this holiday to look like with COVID, e-commerce surges, etc.?
That's a very good question. I mean, we already saw kind of a spike earlier this year, where during the whole lockdown. I mean, so I don't know. So just as context, we're from Germany basically. So there was a time when we had, at least in Central Europe, a lockdown, and some e-commerce shops had a even higher peak than last Black Friday, which is usually where the Christmas peak is. And I think it really depends on whether there's another lockdown happening in Europe. If there's another lockdown, I'm pretty sure it's gonna, I don't know, like go completely crazy, even more than the years before. Right now, I would estimate that it's probably a bit more than last year, because people would rather stay at home than go out shopping. So I definitely expect a higher peak than last year, but like, depending on how high the peak will go, I guess depends on whether there's another lockdown or not, and that's something that, yeah, we don't really know at the moment, but we'll see. We're definitely prepared for that.
Fair enough. I hope we don't have to use your preparedness for another lockdown, but let's see how it goes. Very good. One more question. Would it be possible to have some heuristics regarding wrong address in the case of user mistypes, for example?
It's a good question. So I don't have any data on hand at the moment, but I guess it's something you could to some degree calculate in terms of, I mean, we know how many parcels we get back based on incorrect address. But the most common issues we see is because, not necessarily because like misspelling or anything, but usually there's the house number missing, or you enter the wrong country, like you enter Germany, but actually you're living in France, for example. Or one particular issue, but I think that's more specific for the German market. So in Germany, we have this concept of like DHL, so kind of a drop-off station. So it works like you have this machine, and you can enter the machine, like the number of this DHL drop-off station, and then you have what's called a post number. It's kind of your membership number from DHL. And DHL requires that number in a specific field. And a lot of customers are either forgetting that, or they entering it into the wrong field, or they add post number before that, or they write it next to the name. So there's like a lot of different ways how I can do it wrongly. So in this particular case, one thing that we offer or that we recommend to our customers, if they know they have a significant amount of shipments to a post station, that during the checkout you can select, is it a residential address or is it a DHL drop-off station? And if it's a drop-off station, then you have specific fields which you need to enter so that you don't have these mistakes. But that is, all different types of issues. But I guess the point I wanted to make during the presentation was that while you should make sure that you reduce the number of address errors, because one of the things that happens is if you don't realize that the address is incorrect, you might ship it out. Then you first have to pay the shipment, which goes to the incorrect recipient. You have to pay the return, because obviously the carrier charges something that comes back, and then you have to pay a third time because now you have the correct address and you need to ship it out again. And besides that, you also have a delay, like your customer might get nervous because they don't have the parcel. But then again, you also don't want to make it too specific. This example of requiring a postal code, because then you might risk that the customer doesn't buy in your online shop because maybe for him it doesn't work because they don't have a postal code or because their address is too long or something. And the one thing that we saw works actually quite well is to have kind of this autocomplete feature from, for example, Google, where it's just the rate is reduced basically. But that's our findings. What we're also trying to do more in the future is kind of do more advanced address checks. So there's some APIs available, for example, DHL, where you can actually send them the address and they tell you whether it's a valid address or not. At least in Germany, they have actually quite a good database in terms of like address names and so on. So there's some validation you can do. But then again, if you ship it to, I don't know, like Netherlands or Poland or whatever, there might not be that good of a database. So it's not that easy, I think, to do. But yeah, I think that's something to be aware of especially if you haven't had an online shop before. That's maybe one thing you don't really think about, how many people don't know their own address. So that was kind of interesting, at least for me when we got started.
Awesome. One question, you mentioned a few different solutions there, but is there a specific shop or ERP system that you would recommend?
I guess it really depends on the use case, what you want to do. I don't think there's one solution fits all. Usually what I would recommend is if you really have a simple product which doesn't require any super special treatment or anything, or if you just want to get started fast, what I would recommend is a system like, for example, Shopify, or depending again on your region, there's also PrestaShop and some others, where it's really easy to get started and you can do it within a week or something, where you can set up your website and so on. If you want to do some kind of custom development, you want to develop your own plugins and so on, WooCommerce is actually quite diverse in that direction, but there you really need to know it, because if you're not an expert, then you might easily mess things up. And if you really want to use an ERP system, there's things like, just thinking like Plenty Markets, for example, is one that's quite common in Germany. There's another one, Bright Pearl in the UK, for example, which is quite famous there. And again, depending on your market where you come from, there's other classical ERP systems that you would use there. So at least for the German market, I would probably recommend Shopify, WooCommerce or PrestaShop. And for example, Bilby is another ERP system, although Bilby doesn't have their own storefront, or Plenty Markets, UK, Bright Pearl. So these are some names I know that, for example, you're also integrated with. So that's something I would probably not recommend a specific one, but at least a collection where you could look at and figure out which one is the best for you.
Awesome. One more specific question, and very related to what you do, from which size company or shop or I suppose shipping volume does it make sense to start outsourcing logistics specifically?
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess there's not really, if you have a regular shipping volume, it makes sense to outsource, because again, if you have a new online shop and you wanna get started, you wanna develop your product, that's something you don't want to do yourself necessarily. It's something that's kind of annoying at some stage where you want to hand it off. So if you have a regular shipping volume with like 1 or 2 parcels per day, it would already make sense to outsource. For us, we made the decision that we have kind of a minimum revenue of 500 euros. So that's around 50, 60 parcels per month where we would start working with a company. If it's less than that, it's usually, 1 or 2 shipments per day, where at least for us, it doesn't really make sense commercially to onboard a customer. So yeah, I would say kind of like rule of thumb is 50, 60 shipments per month is, I think, a good size to really think about that. Because if it's below that, you could maybe even do it yourself. If you only have like 1 or 2 parcels per day, but if you have 10, 20 parcels per day, you actually need an employee which is only doing the picking, packing of your products, which, and there's some complexity with that. What if the employee is sick or anything, or if you have a higher volume to that. So I would say if you have recurring shipments and if you also want to grow, of course, it definitely makes sense to look to outsource that part of the business already early on, and 50-60 is around the size where it really makes sense.
Amazing. We've had very, very substantial engagement from the audience, and we've advanced in time quite a lot. We're nearing the end of the webinar, so thank you everyone for so many very interesting questions. I just have 2 to kind of end the Q&A on that we ask all of our speakers in the e-commerce Behind the Tech Scene series. So the first one is, if we look at e-commerce more globally, what are the trends that you're seeing this year? What has already changed, and what do you foresee coming in 2021?
Yeah. So one thing that we already saw earlier this year, especially with the pandemic, is that quite a lot of also like brick and mortar shops that had kind of a physical store, they started to go into the online shop area, because of course they somehow need to make money, and that's an easy way to do it. So that's also one thing that we saw, for example, as kind of a spike in customer requests from these type of shops. And I think that's also a great opportunity for them to actually get food, because if there's no need, then you wouldn't necessarily start it. But I think that's one way also how they can grow their business. And I think that's a trend that's probably going to go on for the next couple of years. And another quite interesting trend that we also saw is more from like bigger enterprises. So there's some companies that they don't really sell directly to consumers. So for example, if you go to the grocery store, there's some brands that you usually can't buy online. You can only buy them in the grocery store. And we saw a trend, because we also get quite a few like tenders from these type of companies where they want to explore this like what they call direct to consumer market. So they want to also go into more this like online shop, or like online, where they want to sell their products online directly to the consumer. So this is something that's quite interesting that we see independent of the pandemic, but more generally. So as e-commerce is growing, so I think they want to explore more areas as well. So that's kind of interesting as well.
Very, very interesting. Fantastic. And very last question. So within your area of expertise, be it logistics specifically or e-commerce more generally, what is one piece of content you would recommend checking out? This could be a podcast, a book, or kind of an article that you found really impactful.
Yeah. So that's kind of a German speaking thing. So there's this from the Merchant Inspiration Talks from, actually, I think it's actually in English. No, sorry. It's also in English. The Merchant Inspiration Talks, it's kind of a podcast on, I think, a monthly basis. You can listen to them on, I think, Spotify as well, or on the web. More generally about tech, one podcast I particularly like to listen about is the Modern CTO from Joe Beasley, I think he's called. A weekly podcast where he invites kind of CTOs from different areas, which is kind of interesting to listen about. And last but not least, like one book I would recommend, although it's not specific to e-commerce or logistics in particular, but as a founder, I really liked reading that book. It's called The Hard Thing About Hard Things from Ben Horowitz. This is kind of interesting how he founded the company and grew that. So if you're a founder, if you're want to build a company, I would definitely recommend that. It's quite kind of interesting.
That's amazing. I'm taking some notes, so I'll be doing some online shopping to to acquire that book later today. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Sebastian. It was really, really interesting, incredibly insightful. I've personally enjoyed it very much, and I'm sure everyone has. Thank you everyone for joining. A quick reminder that today was the second talk of a series of webinars, and there is another one coming next week, September 30th on the same time. The topic is the tech ecosystem behind scalable e-commerce. So we hope you join us again. Thanks again, Sebastian, very much, and hope you have a fantastic rest of the day.
Thanks, you too. It was a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.